Welcome back to Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We are back in the studio with my two favorite guests, Anthony Ventura, real estate attorney, and Jim Harrison, CEO of the MLS Listings in Sunnyvale. Welcome, fellas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are back to review the Off-MLS issue, also known back east as whisper listings.
Yeah.
And throughout the country, pocket listings. So let's start with you. In a nutshell, what is a pocket listing or off-MLS?
Well, obviously, pocket listings have always existed. They were folded up in somebody's pocket, and somebody would decide who they were going to share that with. But today, it's become more of a business practice for a large percentage of agents in the marketplace. And the reasons we're told that properties are marketed off the MLS is for privacy, or to keep them from being syndicated onto the internet, or to control that listing, or maybe something about security for the clients, and to keep them exclusive to the listing agent.
So typically when a realtor, Tony, a realtor, and you're from a family of realtors, your dad owns a brokerage, you have an uncle,
Yes.
your sister's a realtor, your wife's
Yes.
a realtor, right? So that's a interesting barbecue, the conversation there. So typically when a real estate licensee takes a listing, what do they do with the listing?
Well, the first thing they're supposed to do is walk through the terms of it with their client, explain the different duties and obligations that the real estate agent has, and get the client to sign it.
Okay. And then once they get the house ready for market, it's all polished, everything's wonderful, and then they put it on the multiple listing service?
That is the standard in practice.
Okay. Now there are cases, Jim, where when a family might not want it on the MLS, whether it's a judge or a celebrity or multi-million dollars. Can you speak to that?
Well, there are legitimate cases where they want to keep it secret. There's no sign in the yard. Most people don't even know it's for sale. And it may be marketed to kind of a private network of agents as opposed to broadly on the internet or in the MLS system.
And that's when the seller is fully informed that if they put it on the MLS, there might be thousands of agents and 100 websites.
Thousands of websites.
Thousands of websites and hundreds of third-party vendors that will have their widgets on the internet promoting it. But again, if we have somebody that's home sick and their room looks like a hospital bed, or they're a prominent member of a football team or something, that might be a legitimate reason not to have it on the multiple listing service. Okay, let's speak about now. We've had other shows about this issue, and during the Great Recession, we were at a peak of how many listings on your MLS?
About 18,000.
18,000. And most, if you had a home for sale, it was probably on the MLS,
yes.
okay? And I remember that because other licensees, real estate agents, would stop me and pitch their listing to me as a form of conversation. And then as soon as the inventory started to shrink and the economy heated up, all of a sudden we started to see these off-MLS listings appear. Okay? Now, you brought a slide here, a great slide, your great team puts it together. Now, let's just review again, why is it happening, the off-MLS on page 2 here?
Well, it's happening. Some people claim it's for security, for privacy for their clients.
Oh, security. And then in terms of, it's an exclusive, so sometimes the agent thinks that makes it fancy for some reason.
Well, almost all listings are exclusive.
Okay. Now, you had spoken about, in the past, Tony, we talked about the legal and financial risk.
Right. The biggest financial risk is properties that are not put on the MLS tend to sell for less money. If you think of, we're taught in law school that you think of, real estate or property as a bundle of sticks, and you have a number of sticks that are the people that are potential buyers of a property, and you want as many people to see it as possible, which usually means putting it on the MLS. If you don't put it on the MLS, you're eliminating a number of those sticks from ever seeing your property. So if you believe that the more exposure, the higher the price, then by limiting it and limiting the number of views or people who know about it by taking it off the MLS, you put yourself at risk of earning less money.
Now, what about, Jim, on the code of ethics?
Well, it could be a violation of the code of ethics because they're obligated to to cooperate with each other to share their listings. And so it really needs to be more the exception than the rule that they don't put a listing in the MLS for one of the reasons we mentioned before.
Okay, because the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Realtors is over 100 years old.
Right.
And part of sharing the information, and of course the brokerage fees for that matter.
Right, they're sharing compensation, they're cooperating with each other.
Okay. Now, let's get specific. We have real estate attorney Tony Ventura with us. The fiduciary duty, can you explain what a fiduciary duty is from a licensee to their client, the seller?
The listing agent has a fiduciary duty to the seller, essentially to obtain the highest price possible for the sale of the property. The fiduciary duty is the duty to act in the highest level of integrity, loyalty, and trust towards your client. A fiduciary duty is the highest duty that we have under the law. So the question really comes down in these cases from a legal perspective of what was the genesis of the basis to take the property off the MLS. If the seller initially says, I really don't want the people to know about this because I want privacy or my heirs or my security or whatever, that's one thing. When the genesis of the idea comes from the real estate agent as to the seller as to the reasons why you may want to keep it off the MLS, that's when you potentially have a breach of a fiduciary duty because the agent's looking potentially to benefit themselves as opposed to the seller.
Okay, now that MLS stands for Multiple Listing Service, and that's what the Realtors, National Association of Realtors put together years ago to share their information. And back in the day, it was in a book form, and then it got onto the internet, and now we share that with outside vendors.
Right.
Okay, so we now have how many vendors, Jim, connected to your multiple listing service?
300.
Over 300 vendors, and how many active members, licensees?
Oh, 17,000.
17,000. Okay.
Plus, we reciprocate with our neighboring MLSs as well as Southern California. So the listings our agents put in our system are exposed to 100,000 realtors, real estate professionals in Southern California, to 30,000 real estate professionals in the East Bay, and real estate professionals in San Francisco, in Sacramento, and Marin, and the whole North Bay.
And because you created that wonderful website, anyone around the world can view homes in Silicon Valley, right?
Yep.
Okay. Now we're just going to touch on this briefly with fair housing. If a licensee has it off market and there's a sign out front that says coming soon, and he or she is only showing it to their clients, that could be a potential fair housing claim. In other words, they're calling up, if another agent calls up and says, may I show your home on 123 Main Street, the listing agent who has it off MLS and wants to sell it in-house may say, no, thank you.
Right. One of the problems with an off-market property is the agent becomes the gatekeeper of who gets to see it.
Good point.
So if you go back to that bundle of sticks analogy, you may end up with a bunch of, the only sticks left are the type of sticks the agent wants in that area. So for instance, if you have an area that's primarily one ethnicity and the agent's that same ethnicity and the seller's that same ethnicity, they may only, in their pocket listing, only look to other people from that same ethnicity. The problem with that is it becomes discriminatory because it then excludes other races or ethnicities from buying that property or in that area because they don't even know that it's available.
Now that could be a big problem not only for the seller but especially the listing agent because they could lose their license.
Yes.
For that matter, right? The antitrust, you've talked about that before, where when this started there was actually groups of agents around the Bay Area, around Silicon Valley, that were sharing. It's like a Tupperware party.
Yeah, there's private networks. One of them went out of business. There's another one that's still in business that's gotten pretty big. And they are only sharing with each other. They're not sharing with the marketplace at large.
Wow. So we will get into the numbers in a minute, but the problem with that, Tony, is if somebody they've been in the neighborhood 25 years and they sell their house, and then they had it on the MLS, the multiple listing service, and had broker tours and open houses, newspaper ads, websites, and they sold it for a certain amount. Now the next family that's selling their house has it off MLS and does not get 2, 4, 6, 8 offers and does not sell it over list price and sells it for dramatically lower than the sale 3 weeks earlier. That is a claim where the listing agent could be shown to breach his or her fiduciary duty.
Yes. Eventually, the seller, if the seller of that second property finds out that they sold it for $150,000 less, they may turn around to the listing agent and make a claim and say, well, why did this happen? Because you didn't put it on the MLS. And frankly, at least in our area, putting a property on the MLS for years and years has been the standard of care for a real estate agent, because you want to maximize exposure. So when a real estate agent doesn't put it on the MLS, then the risk is, well, you fell below the standard of care, and the result of that, the monetary damage, is the difference in the value of the property. If the market, if it would have been put on the MLS, would have sold for $1 million, but it actually sold for $850,000, then the seller can make a claim for $150,000 of damage against their agent for breach of fiduciary duty.
Now also, I would imagine, and I hear this often, that the real estate attorney will, the first question in the deposition will say, why did you do this? Didn't you want 2 brokerage fees? In other words, oftentimes that off-MLS listing agent represented the buyer and the seller.
Yes, in many instances, what's driving the genesis of why it's going to be off market is the agent wants to double in the commission,
Right.
which means not only they're dual agents, now in addition to a fiduciary duty issue, there's a dual agency issue where the agent represented both the buyer and the seller. And you look at that situation where it sells for less than it should have, seems like a fairly simple claim to make, that the fiduciary placed the interest of the buyer over the interest of the seller.
Now, Jim, we have been speaking about this. I was on the, in all fairness, full disclosure, I was on your task force about the off-MLS issue that was arising. And we have spoken about this before, where of the off-MLS sales, approximately 20% of them, that listing agent represented the buyer and the seller.
So I know that roughly 20% sold off the MLS. I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
If the tax records don't show me who the agents were that represented the clients.
Okay. Now, that we're speaking about agency now, where there oftentimes these homes are sold in-house. So, Tony, can you explain how an agent in California is described at the brokerage level?
The broker is the entity or the person that has the license and the ability to represent the seller.
Okay.
So then the broker may have agents that work underneath him or her, underneath the corporate license. But ultimately, when you determine whether or not there's a dual agent involved, even though the phrase is dual agent, what you're really looking at is the broker level. Is the
Right.
broker the same that represents both the buyer and the seller?
Right, okay. So that's what I mean by off-MLS. Oftentimes, one firm represented the buyer and the seller on that particular transaction,
Yes.
and that's dual agency. Now, Jim, let's look at your slide here. You had a good point here on number 4 is, why does it, what does it mean in terms of the impact?
Well, the impact is devastating to the entire marketplace, because without the data, because we're all about the data, without the data, the CMAs aren't going to be correct, the market appraisals are not going to be correct, compensation's impacted for agents that didn't get to be involved in those transactions. There's a trust issue, collaboration is impacted, and cooperation, because you're not working together, which is the whole genesis of why an MLS exists, is for cooperation and compensation. So it impacts everything.
Now, you were speaking about the CMA. Can you explain what a CMA is?
Comparative market analysis, when you're trying to determine what a home is worth, either because you're listing it or you're bringing in a buyer and you want to do a CMA to see what the comps are, so that you understand whether or not, what kind of offer you want to make on the property.
Okay, you also mentioned appraisal. Now, that's from the bank or the lending?
Yeah, the
refinance?
lending community uses the multiple listing service, and so if the property's not in the MLS, then it can't be used as a comp.
Now, you have spoken in the past about they will often, sometimes they'll use your MLS where they have it on Craigslist, they have a coming soon sign on the lawn, and then they sell it in-house, they ratify a sale, and then they put it on your multiple listing service.
We allow comp-only listings. There's a whole lot of listings in our database that have 0 to 1 days on market, where it was sold and then it was put in the MLS.
Now, we know what happened there, right? That was sold in-house?
It was sold outside the cooperative.
Okay. Now, in terms of the numbers, let's get into the numbers. Now, your multiple listing service covers how many counties?
5 counties.
5 counties. Now, let's go into page 7 in terms of on MLS sales. We've done this show, and we've talked about these numbers many times, but compared to the first quarter of 2012, on MLS, of the sales, 87%.
Right.
Okay. Now the first quarter of this year, 2018, 78%.
Yeah, the difference is the inventory is down substantially. And so as the inventory declines, the off-MLS practices increase.
Now we'll speak to we just happen to have a real estate attorney here. Now, can you see why these numbers come together? In other words, in the Great Recession, we had 18,000 listings. Everybody had it on their multiple listing service. They were doing open houses left and right, Mercury News ads, everything. And now the market starts to shrink up and paychecks are few and far between. Now suddenly we have dual agency and in-house sales.
As the inventory goes down, especially as it's been here the last couple of years, having a listing can be like shooting a fish in a barrel, in that there are so few listings and so few buyers. There are many agents that have 5 or 6 or 7 buyers, and so they get a listing. It becomes very easy to pitch that listing to one of your existing buyers that's already been searching for months or years to try to find a property. From an agent's perspective, it's beneficial on both sides. I mean, not only does the agent then get to double in the commission and earn the whole 5 or 6%, but there's also a lot less work involved because you don't have to have open houses or marketing materials or other time-consuming things because you're selling it between 2 of your clients.
Oh, that's a good point, because you've mentioned you, of course, grew up in a real estate office, and you know when an agent is in trouble and you depose them and you fine-tune how active they were in that transaction, you've mentioned in the past you could count 8, 10, 12 hours that that listing agent put into it.
Yes, especially on an off-market double-ended deal, especially if both of the clients or previous clients of yours or people that trust you very much, where there's not going to be any questions asked, your word's going to be trusted and taken for granted as being true. It's pretty simple to fill out the contract, fill out the forms, do the disclosures, and get ready to close escrow.
Now this is where we're going to get a little off topic, no pun intended here on the off-MLS, but when a licensee is representing a buyer and another licensee representing the seller, it's always been my experience that the best transaction has 2 roof inspections, 2 chimney inspections, 2 termite inspections, and so on and so forth. Now, typically when we have these dual agencies, there might not be inspections involved.
Right, and a part of that's also driven by the market, especially unique to Santa Clara County or San Mateo County, where there's so few properties for sale at given times. There's people buying property sight unseen without even necessarily going in them or going in them for longer than 15 minutes. Well, they'll make non-contingent offers and go hundreds of thousands of dollars over the list price. So the level of due diligence that you're seeing by buyers is much, much less than it would be if there were more inventory in the market.
And that also is agent driven. I think it's agent driven, where the agent might say, oh, you don't need a chimney inspection, even though we had the quake in '89 and we still have broken many times. When you have a chimney inspection, the chimney is broken at the roof line and no one's discovered it.
Right.
So, okay, let's go on to another slide here, Jim. On number 8. Now these are the off-MLS sales. Just can you talk about what happened in the first quarter of 2013?
2013 is when we started losing inventory. It seems like the majority of our off-MLS listings happen in the first quarter of each year.
That's because it was a long winter.
Yeah.
And spent a lot of money at Christmas, and the agents might need a couple paychecks on one. Now, at that first quarter of 2013, that was 26% were off MLS. Okay. Q1 2013, 26% of the listings. Now, that's potentially a lot of lawsuits for real estate attorneys.
Yes, but unfortunately, a lot of times the sellers in those cases where they ended up selling their property for less money don't know that anything wrong happened.
Right.
Because if they place a lot of trust into their into their agent, and they believe the agent got them a fair price or got them more than the property was worth, they're not questioning the validity of the sale. I mean, I've seen agents who will use a comparative market analysis to show the house is worth, say, $800,000, then get an off-market offer for $850,000, but the property is really worth $1 million. So, but the perception they're communicating to the client is we got above, what we would have listed it for by doing it off-market. Most of the instances where people come to me for a consultation or to talk about what happened, it's when the heirs or the children find out that their parents or one of their parents sold the property, and they go on a certain database and find out it's worth X, and find out that their parents sold it for less than that, and then they want to talk to an attorney and see what their remedies are.
Now, in all fairness, I've seen you speak many times at real estate associations, and you've often said that most agents do a good job of solving people's problems.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, one of the reasons, at those different seminars I talk about all these different crazy cases that I've had is because it takes usually pretty unique circumstances where agents can't resolve the problem, or the parties and the agents can't resolve the problem on their own, and they need to bring a lawyer in.
Now, one example you often give, of course, you grew up in a real estate office, you know this more than anyone, and I just heard this from a colleague of my son. They will shopping for a car. They will go to Gilroy and Berkeley and South San Francisco to save $100 when it comes to a licensee, they hire the first agent that comes along.
Right, and there's a lot of trust placed between a buyer or seller and their agent, because the market is very confusing, and it is a large, these are the largest investments people are going to make, so they place a lot of trust, and they tend to not ask as many questions as they would maybe in other transactions where they feel they can get their arms around the scope of the problem.
Okay, because this trust factor is very important, especially here at the table. And I always talk about the kitchen table where the listing agent, and of course your wife is a broker, right? So we have a family affair here of agents but it happens at the kitchen table oftentimes on a Saturday or after dinner during the week. And during the Great Recession, the agents were talking about they had have all their brochures and a fancy brochure and the Mercury News ads and the broker tour and the open houses and whatnot, and everything they're going to do to expose this property. And then suddenly, magically, as the inventory started to recede, this very same agent would be in the same neighborhood at somebody else's kitchen table saying, "You don't want a bunch of people on this white carpet, do you? I have buyers here at the office. Why don't let's see if I can, take care of this. We don't have to do the broker tour and the open house and a bunch of strangers come through your house."
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways that an agent can explain why keeping the property off market is a good idea. And sometimes agents can be very persuasive in selling that. The problem is that the biggest issue is the less money you're going to receive on that offer, and that part doesn't get communicated.
Right.
They make it seem like I have buyers, they know what the market is, they're still going to pay market price. Probably one of the best examples is in a deposition, an agent, admitted that he told his sellers that I have buyers that want to buy it off market and they'll overpay for it, but if it goes on the market, they won't make an offer.
Well, speaking of numbers, we're going to get into the numbers here. By the way, I never forgot during the Great Recession, at the beginning of the Great Recession, I was calling up to preview homes and set up a showing. And back then you could show 7 or 8 homes, really nice homes, on Saturday and do it again on Sunday. And a boy answered. And I said, "I'm Pat Kapowich, I'd like to show your house." And he said, "Let me check." And he asked his parents, and I heard the commotion in the back. "Yes, you could come at 2 o'clock. And the boy answered, and I could tell he was not well. And his bedroom looked like a hospital room. So that family knew, in order to get top dollar, regardless of our son's condition, we need to get it on the market and get it exposed. So that one of those excuses, I think, is out the window in terms of... Right? Okay, so off-MLS, let's talk about the real numbers that these agents are not sharing at the kitchen table. In terms of billions of dollars, here on page 11 of your wonderful slide, 2011, in terms of billions of dollars off-market sales.
$2.5 billion.
$2.5 billion. Now we fast forward to, it goes up all the way to 2017.
Yeah, $5.9 billion
off market.
Sold off the MLS.
Okay. Now, that is a lot of, in a remaining minute here, in terms of the median price. Let's skip ahead. Before we've gone up the numbers, but now in 2017, what was the delta between on market and off market?
If they were sold through the MLS, they got on the average $180,000 more
Wow.
than what the properties got that were sold off the MLS.
Now, that'd be real hard for an agent and being deposed to discuss.
Right, and as you say, the conversation at the kitchen table, it's one thing to talk about keeping the carpet clean and keeping visitors out of your house, but then you also have to say, but on average you may get $150,000, $180,000, $200,000 less, and that usually would change the seller's mind to say,
Yeah.
it's worth it to get my carpet a little dirty.
There you go. Hey, guys, thanks again for coming out today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Good to
Thanks
see
for
you.
having us here.
Thanks again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week.